In 1988, one of America's smallest railroads acquired one of its biggest, when the Denver and Rio Grande, a comparatively compact railroad tailored to the unique operational conditions of the Rocky Mountains of Colorado and Utah, acquired and merged with the Southern Pacific, one of the foremost names in the U.S. railway industry, but one that had fallen on hard times due to the rapidly evolving state of the market and operational conditions. Thus, this merged entity would only last 8 years, and despite holding a large section of the rail market for the western United States, the Rio Grande had unfortunately carried over many of the financial and operational burdens of the Southern Pacific that made this gigantic company particularly vulnerable, and thus allowed it to become easy prey to consolidation during the mid-1990s. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway was established in 1870 under the direction of General William Jackson Palmer, who aimed to create a narrow-gauge railway tailored for Colorado's mountainous terrain, with Palmer believing the 3-foot gauge was best suited for steep remote areas due to its lower construction costs and ability to handle tight curves, an idea reinforced by his study of similar systems abroad, most notably in Wales, with the line's original purpose being to run from Denver to El Paso, Texas via Pueblo and the San Luis Valley. Construction began in 1871 and quickly reached Colorado Springs, and by 1874 the railway had extended to Cañon City, though the company soon found itself in fierce competition with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway over control of the Royal Gorge, leading to the infamous Royal Gorge War from 1877 to 1880, but after a contentious legal battle and physical struggle, a compromise granted the Denver and Rio Grande rights through the gorge, allowing expansion to Leadville. In 1881, Palmer created the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railway in Utah, aiming to connect Salt Lake City with Colorado's advancing line, and the two ends would meet in March 1883 near Green River, Utah, completing a trans-mountain narrow-gauge corridor. Though financial trouble soon followed, prompting Palmer's resignation from the Colorado line in 1883 and the company's receivership in 1884, after which it was reorganized in 1886 and eventually merged with its Utah counterpart in 1901. By the late 1880s, the system had become the largest narrow-gauge network in North America, exceeding 1,860 miles, linking Colorado's mining districts and remote communities, though its fortunes waned under George Gould's ownership, whose expansionist policies led to financial overreach, and the railroad entered receivership during World War I and was operated under federal control between 1917 and 1920, emerging from foreclosure in 1921 and being renamed to the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad during that same year. During trusteeship in the 1930s, the railway underwent major modernization, including the completion of the Moffat Tunnel in 1928 and the Docero Cutoff in 1934, which improved route efficiency and reduced the reliance on steep mountain passes, and by the post-war period, the Denver and Rio Grande Western had become a modern freight carrier, adopting diesel locomotives and streamlined operations, while also partnering with other railroads to provide the scenic California Zephyr from 1949, a passenger train renowned for its luxurious service and mountain views. Over time, the narrow-gauge system declined due to changing economic conditions, and while most of it was dismantled or sold, 2 scenic segments were preserved as tourist lines, including the Cumbres to Toltec Scenic Railroad and the Durango and Silverton Narrow-Gauge Railroad, while the last of the Rio Grande-operated narrow-gauge lines were sold in 1981. The 1980s would begin a profound legislative shift in the American railway industry, as with the Staggers Act of 1980, this landmark deregulation measure dismantled many of the long-standing federal controls on freight rail pricing, service, and routing, and for the Rio Grande, this legislation heralded both an opportunity and adversity. While it allowed greater pricing flexibility, it also removed the protective rate structures that had previously shielded the Rio Grande from intense competition, with this new environment favoring larger interconnected systems capable of offering end-to-end service at competitive rates, while smaller carriers like the Rio Grande, which had long relied on partnerships and interchanges, found themselves more vulnerable to market shifts and consolidation trends. Compounding this upheaval was the collapse of the Rock Island Railroad later that same year, with the Rock Island having been one of the Rio Grande's most important eastern interchange partners, particularly at Denver, with its liquidation severing a crucial link in the Rio Grande's transcontinental bridge line strategy, narrowing the available routing options for moving freight efficiently across the country. By 1982, the situation had further intensified when the Union Pacific completed its acquisition of the Western Pacific and Missouri Pacific Railroads, creating a vast unified system that swept aside regional rivals and fundamentally altered the Western rail map, a key consequence of which for the Rio Grande was the effective loss of its eastern gateway at Pueblo, Colorado. This junction had been critical to accessing markets via the Missouri Pacific lines, and while the Rio Grande did manage to negotiate trackage rights through to Kansas City, a modest concession under the circumstances, it was clear that the balance of power in the region was tilting dramatically towards larger carriers. Despite these challenges, the Rio Grande continued to assert itself as a competitive transcontinental bridge line throughout the early 1980s, with its central corridor connecting Ogden, Utah to St. Louis, Missouri, remaining a vital artery for through freight traffic, while the railroad's operational model emphasized short, fast freight trains, which had long been a hallmark of its service philosophy. Simultaneously, the Rio Grande capitalized on the booming demand for Western steam coal, developing a profitable niche as a hauler of high BTU coal from the mines of Colorado and Utah to power plants across the Midwest and beyond, and by the middle of the decade, coal had become the railroad's most significant and stable source of revenue, even as its fast freight strategy came under increasing pressure due to rising diesel fuel costs and the economies of scale enjoyed by larger railroads running long, heavy trains at slower speeds. Amidst this challenging climate, Rio Grande Industries, the holding company of the railroad, began exploring its future options, and in February 1984, entered preliminary talks regarding a potential acquisition, with October of that year seeing the company sold to Denver-based entrepreneur Philip Anschutz and his firm, the Anschutz Corporation, in a transaction valued at approximately $496 million. Anschutz, already successful in the energy and real estate sectors, recognized the strategic value of the Rio Grande despite its declining market position, and he saw potential in its physical assets, geographic location, and operational efficiency, thus intending to use the railroad as a platform for future expansion in the Western rail industry. It was during 1985, however, that the Rio Grande would begin its motions as to elevating itself from the position of a small independent firm into being a major player of the Western railroad scene, that being amid the proposed and highly controversial merger discussions between the Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe. The Southern Pacific Railroad, widely regarded as one of the most influential and recognizable institutions in the history of American railroading, had a history that lay in the Sacramento Valley Railroad, which was chartered in 1856 as one of the earliest rail ventures in California, with this relatively short line soon becoming part of the ambitious Central Pacific Railroad, which played a pivotal role in the construction of the first transcontinental railroad. In 1869, the Central Pacific connected with the Union Pacific at Promontory Summit, Utah, completing a monumental engineering achievement that symbolized the unification of the American interior with the Pacific coast, with the Central Pacific expanding aggressively in the post-Civil War period, laying thousands of miles of track and acquiring a number of small lines throughout California and the Western Territories, and by the 1880s, it had adopted the name Southern Pacific, under which it continued its acquisitive and expansionist strategy. By the close of the 19th century, the Southern Pacific system had grown into a vast rail network extending from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, with its main lines and branch lines linking major cities such as San Francisco, Los Angeles, El Paso, and New Orleans, passing through a broad array of landscapes and economic zones, from California's Central Valley to the deserts of Arizona and the oil fields of Texas. It became renowned for its efficient freight services and luxurious passenger trains, including the celebrated Daylight series, which operated in a striking orange, red, and silver livery and symbolized the golden age of American streamliner travel, while also amassing extensive real estate holdings, much of which granted by the federal government as an incentive for railroad construction, particularly in California, where the company became a powerful political tool and economic force. During the early to mid-20th century, the Southern Pacific solidified its role as a dominant Western rail carrier, with its freight operations transporting a wide range of goods, including agricultural products, timber, petroleum, and manufactured goods, facilitating the growth of numerous industries along its lines, and though it continued to operate long-distance passenger trains, by the 1950s and 60s, these services were in decline due to growing competition from automobiles and airlines. Southern Pacific also owned and operated the St. Louis Southwestern Railway, commonly known as the Cotton Belt, which further extended its reach into the south and southeast, while the company also invested in technological innovation, adopting early forms of centralized traffic control, diesel locomotives, and containerized intermodal services to remain competitive. The Southern Pacific's strategic ambition remained evident well into the 1960s, as in 1964, it attempted to strengthen its position in the central United States by seeking to acquire a portion of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, and although this bid ultimately failed, it highlighted the company's desire to secure a more robust east-west transcontinental corridor in the face of intensifying industrial consolidation. The following decades brought further challenges, with the 1970s seeing mounting financial strain across the rail industry, with declining revenues, regulatory constraints, and aging infrastructure combining to erode profitability, with the Southern Pacific being no exception, and its operations became increasingly difficult to sustain. By the early 1980s, the Southern Pacific Transportation Company had fallen decidedly upon hard times, and despite its vast network, it had become burdened by aging infrastructure, a bloated cost structure, and an inability to adapt swiftly to the demands of a deregulated environment. Thus, in a bid to reinvent itself, Southern Pacific's parent company joined with that of the Santa Fe in 1983 to form the Santa Fe Southern Pacific Corporation, with this corporate merger being intended as a prelude to the operational consolidation of the two railroads, but their plan encountered a significant obstacle when, in 1986, the Interstate Commerce Commission rejected the proposed operational merger on antitrust grounds, with the ICC's concern being that such a combination would reduce competition, especially in the overlapping markets served by both lines, and thus the Santa Fe Southern Pacific was compelled to divest one of the two carriers. One of the more vocal critics against the SFSP merger was Phil Anschutz, who publicly opposed this move as he viewed it as a threat to the competitive balance of Western railroading and began preparing Rio Grande to expand its footprint. When the Santa Fe Southern Pacific was ultimately forced to sell the Southern Pacific Transportation Company, a bidding contest quickly emerged, with several contenders submitting offers, including Kansas City Southern Industries, the Railway Labor Executive Association, and management groups from within Southern Pacific itself. But despite being the smallest of the serious bidders, Anschutz's Rio Grande Industries offered $1.02 billion in cash and agreed to assume approximately $780 million in SP's existing debt, bringing the overall value of the offer to around $1.8 billion. This deal was structured for rapid approval, and although rival bids were in some cases higher in financial terms, Anschutz's proposal was viewed as simpler to implement and far more favorable in terms of regulatory scrutiny, with the Department of Transportation and the Justice Department endorsing the transaction. And on August 9, 1988, the ICC granted its full approval, with Anschutz's acquisition being seen as a bold yet pragmatic solution to years of uncertainty surrounding SP's future. Official control passed to Rio Grande Industries on October 13, 1988, and the acquisition of the Southern Pacific was viewed positively as a means of enhancing competition, improving network integration, and offering a more efficient alternative to dominant rivals like the Union Pacific and the Burlington Northern. Despite the acquisition, the Rio Grande did not vanish immediately, and for the first several years following the merger, the Rio Grande continued to function as a separate division within the larger corporate umbrella, with its locomotives, infrastructure, and employee practices remaining largely intact, and the Rio Grande's identity, both culturally and visually, was preserved. However, by 1992, the independent operations were brought to an end, and the system was reorganized operationally under the Southern Pacific Line's identity, effectively subsuming the Rio Grande into a broader coast-to-coast brand. And while locomotives retained their Denver and Rio Grande Western reporting marks and were often seen in their distinctive speed lettering paint schemes, the Southern Pacific name became the dominant face of the new system. Instead, what replaced it was essentially a hybrid of the former Rio Grande and Southern Pacific liveries, with the navy blue of the Southern Pacific being combined with the speed lettering of the Rio Grande during 1993 to create a pleasing mixture of the two, while the Southern Pacific's bloody nose red was carried through onto the new livery. Financially, the combined SP system represented a formidable if imperfect enterprise, with the end of the 1980s seeing the unified Southern Pacific and Rio Grande lines generate approximately $2.5 billion annually in operating revenues and employed more than 26,000 people across 15 states, with Southern Pacific contributing the lion's share of physical infrastructure, with over 13,000 miles of track to the Rio Grande's 2,200 miles. The network now stretched from the Pacific Northwest in California to the Gulf Coast and Midwest, connecting key economic hubs such as Portland, Los Angeles, San Francisco, El Paso, New Orleans, Ogden, and St. Louis, with the merger giving the Southern Pacific renewed access to the Central Corridor, one of the last remaining competitive routes through the Rockies and across the heart of the American West. Operational changes were swift and deeply felt, with the Denver and Rio Grande Western having built its reputation on fast, high-priority freight operations, often moving shorter, more agile trains across the mountains with quick turnaround times, though this philosophy was gradually replaced by Southern Pacific's longer-standing practice of assembling large, heavy trains prioritized for fuel efficiency over speed. This change in doctrine was partially driven by rising fuel costs and a shift in corporate strategy following the oil shocks of the 1970s, and as longer and slower trains became the norm, some of the Rio Grande's most notable corridors saw reductions in traffic or changes in their function, with the storied Moffat route across the Continental Divide seeing a decline in manifest freight operations, with many transcontinental trains being routed over the higher but more direct Tennessee Pass instead, while Denver, once a critical interchange point for the Rio Grande with connections to the Burlington Northern and Rock Island, seeing its strategic importance diminish as traffic was diverted elsewhere. Throughout this period, coal remained the cornerstone of the railroad's financial performance, with the rich bituminous coal fields of Colorado and Utah continuing to fuel much of the revenue base, with unit coal trains operating at high frequency, while in 1995, amid anticipation of both continuing coal demand and the need for increased efficiency, SP made a significant investment in motive power by ordering 278 General Electric AC 4400 CW locomotives. These state-of-the-art units, equipped with alternating current traction motors and superior adhesion, quickly became the dominant power for coal service, supplanting the Rio Grande's earlier fleet of SD40T-2s, SD45s, and GP40s, with these new locomotives, with their imposing size and hauling capabilities, remaining in coal service well into the early years of Union Pacific ownership, as a legacy of the SP's final years. Come the mid-1990s, the Rio Grande and Southern Pacific joint venture was definitely in full recognition of the latter, with the Southern Pacific's grey and red bloody nose livery becoming dominant, while a curious hybridization emerged across the roster, with some locomotives bearing SP colors but retained Rio Grande lettering, while others were patch-numbered or eventually renumbered into Southern Pacific's system. The consolidation also had significant implications for network structure and customer access, as while the merger gave Southern Pacific a revitalized central corridor and improved connections to the Midwest, it also reduced competitive options for many shippers, in particular being the loss of direct interchange with the Burlington Northern at Denver, which cut off a vital route for many freight customers. For others, the merger narrowed their choices in Western rail service, especially as larger systems began to dominate access in key industrial and agricultural regions, and as the SP shifted emphasis away from traditional gateways and routes, many legacy Rio Grande customers faced new routing patterns and service levels. This, therefore, was the crux of the Southern Pacific Rio Grande's downfall, compounded further by the deregulation brought by the Staggers Act in 1980, as while this had initially been beneficial to operational freedom, it also removed many of the rate protections that had sustained smaller or mid-sized bridge carriers such as the Rio Grande. Therefore, as other railroads consolidated and grew in scale, particularly the newly merged Burlington Northern Santa Fe and the increasingly aggressive Union Pacific, Southern Pacific found itself unable to match the financial resources, network coverage, or political leverage of its competitors, while increasing maintenance backlogs, inconsistent service levels, and limited capital investment constrained the SP's ability to remain competitive, especially in high-density intermodal and long-haul freight markets. Therefore, in 1995, the Union Pacific Corporation, already the dominant force along the Western railroads, announced plans to acquire the Southern Pacific Rail Corporation, proposing the $5.4 billion merger as not simply being opportunistic, but also as a strategic response to the earlier union of the Burlington Northern and Santa Fe, which had formed a formidable competitor across the West. Union Pacific, unwilling to be outflanked in key freight corridors, moved decisively to bring the SP Rio Grande network under its control. But the proposed merger faced significant scrutiny from regulators, with the Justice Department, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Agriculture all raising objections related to potential reductions in competition, particularly in markets where Union Pacific and Southern Pacific networks overlapped. Nevertheless, the newly created Surface Transport Board, which had replaced the ICC, approved the merger in 1996, and though the decision included various provisions intended to preserve access for rival carriers and protect shippers, the underlying motivation was clear, with the consolidation promising greater network efficiency, reduced redundancy, and a more robust platform for capital investment, particularly in Southern Pacific's aging infrastructure. On July 3, 1996, the Surface Transportation Board approved the merger after a detailed review, and the acquisition became official on September 11 of the same year, and thus the Rio Grande vanished as a corporate entity for the second and final time, with the merger allowing Union Pacific to consolidate its grip on Western transcontinental freight traffic, but it also marked the end of an era for two of the American West's oldest and most distinctive marks. as Union Pacific streamlined its new acquisition. Remaining locomotives that had once proudly carried the Rio Grande and Southern Pacific's identity were systematically repainted into the corporation's ubiquitous armor yellow and gray scheme, with some units being patch renumbered, with former numbers being obscured and replaced by Union Pacific's. The last locomotive to wear its full Rio Grande livery in regular service, SD40T-2 number 5371, was officially retired in December 2008, with this unit being donated by Union Pacific to the Utah State Railroad Museum in Ogden, while 50 ex-Southern Pacific locomotives are known to still be working in regular operation across the Union Pacific system, either in their pre-Rio Grande merger block lettering livery or the 1992 post-merger livery. In terms of Rio Grande's legacy in the Union Pacific, aside from the 2006 painting of EMD SD70 ACE 1989 into a stylized heritage scheme inspired by the Rio Grande's livery, the line through the Royal Gorge, the Moffat Tunnel, and the approaches to Soldier Summit remain in continued regular use with the Union Pacific, though other routes, such as the Tennessee Pass, have been mothballed, with this once vital coal corridor having seen its last train on August 23, 1997. Nevertheless, the merger of the Southern Pacific and the Rio Grande in 1988 marked an interesting moment in the development of the American West's railroading history, as it demonstrated the somewhat perverse instance of a comparatively small railroad like the Rio Grande, confined mostly to its Rocky Mountain home, being able to acquire a vast corporate empire like the Southern Pacific, which had trackage that encompassed over a quarter of the continental United States. Sadly, this merger also demonstrated the endemic rationalization of the American railroad industry throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, and with the merging of the Burlington Northern and the Santa Fe, it thereby created a playing field of three railroads competing for an increasingly constrained market, of which the Rio Grande and Southern Pacific were the smallest and most financially vulnerable, thus making them easy pickings for Union Pacific's ultimate acquisition in 1996.